You all for joining. This is the third part of our webinar series on cybersecurity. And so want to take this opportunity to thank our partners at Crow for doing this webinar series for us and being a good partner and helping our counties be more cyber secure. I do also want to take the chance to mention that this isn't the end of the conversation. We're actually going to continue talking about cybersecurity at our conference coming up November 12th through 14th. That'll be at the Galt House in Louisville. So hope to see everybody there. If you aren't registered yet, go ahead and get on that. And we'll actually have some folks from the Crow team who will be at the conference as well for any additional questions you might have. So really grateful again that you're here today. Today's session will focus on what strong cybersecurity looks like from the top down and how to move from being reactive to cybersecurity to being resilient and proactive. So, we're very fortunate to have the Incident Response Managing Director from Crow, Joshua Lawrence, here with us, who will be presenting. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we begin. Today's webinar is being recorded, and so we'll share a link to the recording following today's event. Also, this session has been approved for 1 hour of DLG training credit, so make sure to keep your camera on for that. And then at the end of Joshua's presentation, we'll make sure we keep some time for question and answer. So feel free to put any questions that you have throughout the presentation in the chat, and we'll get to those. Or if you want to come off mute by the end, that would work as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Joshua. Thank you again for being here with us.
No problem. Hey, happy to be here, and thank you for letting us partake in this three-part webinar. Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe it's already October, so here we are, approaching the end of the year. So today's session is leading the way. We're to help building a mature cybersecurity program. We've talked about how a leader can implement themselves into a cybersecurity program and what it means for leaders to help mature or identify the cybersecurity program within a county and other types of government agencies. Today, we're going to focus on why does it matter? What does it mean to help interject myself into the cybersecurity program? We do not have to be technical to help mature a cybersecurity program within the confines of the county or government agency. And what are some of those steps we can take, and then helping build the groundwork? And then we'll kind of recover some of those real world incidents that we have encountered and we face, not just from a cybersecurity perspective, but also from an IT perspective. Everybody's probably aware of the AWS incident that's been going on for the past couple of hours, and how much of an impact it's had on availability for services across the globe. And granted, AWS today could be any of the other cloud providers in the future. So how do we identify those services that counties are dependent upon that could put us in a similar situation as what's happening right now? And nothing nefarious. So just introducing myself again, I'm Joshua Lawrence. I'm Incident Response Managing Director here at Crow. Have background for both IT and cybersecurity, both hands-on and managerial roles with the state of Florida. Also was partake a lot of research at Florida State University for operational technology, operational security, critical infrastructure, and then spent some time with your neighbor, Tennessee, at Oak Ridge National Lab. Came over to Silent about 2021, and then we were acquired by Crow at this time. Well, I would say this time, it's now August of 2024, to help with the incident response program here at Crow, and also help with proactive measures within the organization. So today's topic is building off of the last two items that we have talked about. And it's about how, being a leader, you interface with teams, and how do you interface with IT directors? How do you interface with system administrators? How do we help reshape or shape the cybersecurity maturity in an organization? What does the cybersecurity organization, or what does the maturity of a cybersecurity program even look like? How do we measure it? How do we mark it? How do we know we even have cybersecurity measures taking place within the county, within the organization? And how do we go from that reactive mindset to a proactive mindset? Being an incident response, we've walked into many places where incident response and disaster recovery was not on the mind of the organization at the time. It can cause for stressful situations. It can also cause for panic, unorganized work, thought, because there's going to be a lot of questions coming in. There's going to be media reaching out, especially when it's government or health based. Media likes to reach out for incidents occurring within those industries. So how can us as leaders reach out and understand the cybersecurity program of my entity? And it takes a team to build cybersecurity, and it starts with county leaders. It starts with leaders. It's building a program. It's asking questions. How do we identify those gaps? And what do we mean by gaps in an organization? Like what can be done to prevent these threat actors from getting into an environment? We hear all the scary words all day. We hear 0 days, access, data acquisition. It all begins with initial access. A threat actor has to get initial access into the environment to partake and reap harm onto an environment, whether that's a phishing email, which, if you're doing phishing exercises, helps prevent that type of issue within the environment. But how do you ultimately prevent that worst case scenario of the threat actor getting in and performing irreparable damage on an environment, having to build it back? What does it mean? What type of data is impacted? So, how do we prioritize those remediations to help mature cybersecurity in the environment? And how do we develop a plan for risk mitigation? What risk means to one entity might not mean the same as another entity. And in government organizations, we have a broad set of data. We have broad set of organizations that we need to overlook and overtake, and help bridge the gaps between multiple different departments and multiple different organizations, and helping get everybody on the same page. How do you develop cybersecurity policies and procedures in government organizations that can have both constitutional and executive branches? All, yes, trying to achieve the same goal, but can also be uh, broken out and feel independent. How do you bring them together? And it's not just in county, it's also in city. And a lot of times you have a sheriff's department and the county are separate. At the city, you have the police department and the county that are separate. Even though they could be separate entities, how do you bring them together to achieve the same goal? Share information, what each other is seeing. Yeah. How do you have that constant communication, not just between IT and cybersecurity teams, but measures across the board? Uh, there might be something the Department of Elections team is seeing different from your county clerk, different from the sheriff's office. How do you share information from activity that is being seen? And we've also seen places where IT and cybersecurity roles are being worn by the same person, one person wearing multiple hats. Perfectly fine. We have resource constraints. We have uh, real world items that have to go into play to make sure we can fulfill those roles within an environment. And how do we, don't want to necessarily say overcome, but how do we bridge those gaps? Because unfortunately, we've worked with organizations where the cybersecurity measures were there. They were trying to implement them, but they would get trumped by IT tasks that were coming in saying, hey, we need this implemented yesterday. And they would put a pause to a lot of the cybersecurity measures because it was the same team working on the same goals. So, as leaders, how do we help fulfill the cybersecurity tasks along with the IT tasks of the government body? You know, so with today, we're just going to kind of talk about what are those questions that we can ask to help build that baseline, or how do we begin starting with the cybersecurity program, you know, and ultimately, why does it matter? We could say we can point to the news and say, well, we don't want to be in the news, but there's many organizations that are impacted by cybersecurity incidents or events that don't make the news, but does have an impact within the organization. Sometimes it can be a small incident where there's county health data that is protected by PHI regulations that was sent to the wrong person or put into the wrong hands, or an employee that was looking at data that they weren't supposed to be looking at because they weren't authorized to look at it. So even though that's not a cyber criminal, that's not a threat actor, it is still an incident within the government body that has to be handled. Sometimes requires notifications depending on data access versus acquisition. So we have multiple different departments with potential sensitive data across the government body. And a little bit different than private organizations. They have different departments, but they're usually handling similar data. In government bodies, we have multiple departments. We also have public services that need to stay open and function. Because if they go down, the we do have the public, and they do realize when a public function is down, such as being able to search for property title, 911, client documents to upload. So these are all items that can be impacted by not just IT issues, but also cybersecurity. We also have the constitutional departments versus the executive departments, and that's at every functioning department or every functioning government body, from the state level down to the city. You know, and every entity likes to control or have um, oversight over their area, which is perfectly fine. What we like to see, though, is just communication between these entities. How do we share information? How do we share data? How do we share resources if needed to ultimately go towards that one goal of meeting cybersecurity? Because you don't have to necessarily throw every tool at the issue. Matter of fact, it doesn't necessarily need to start with a tool. It needs to start with identification, understanding what is in the county in terms of resources, and how do we handle information, or how do we handle the data. Because if we get called in from an incident response perspective, or any incident response team is getting called in, third party councils and what we call breach councils are going to focus on the data that was either accessed or acquired, and the act functioning of the business, meaning, are government employees able to get paid? What does payroll look like if there's an impact to the systems of the county government? And what services were provided to the public that are now down that need to come back up? And do we have an understanding, if an incident were to happen, does the county board, does the county administrator, do the elected officials, all the way down to the employees handling the data, are we all on the same page if an incident were to occur? How do we know it is a cybersecurity incident versus an IT incident? Case in point, yesterday's AWS down. It was all, the first speculation that came out was AWS was impacted by a cyber incident. And post analysis says they had some issues with some internal functioning hardware that took down their US East 1 environment, unfortunately causing a lot of outage. Uh, but that type of scenario can happen whether it's in the cloud, someone else's data center, or local to your data center. There can be an outage that could be not cybersecurity related. So, how do we identify those impacts to public services? How do we identify those impacts to data overall within the environment? We have multiple different agencies we also have to keep up with, and it can be a swirling of events, because for a county, you could have something that happens at the sheriff's department that does not happen to any other department. You can have something that happens at the elections officials that doesn't happen across the anybody else. You can also have something that happens at vital statistics. Again, it can happen at individual locations within the governing body, but how do you unite and come together and help uh, identify the issues and treat them when they do occur? Yeah. So, what are some of the next steps? How do I build maturity for my cybersecurity program? How do I know I have a control or a function that is maturing at the level of what I need for cybersecurity? Now, does cybersecurity maturity mean that I'm not going to have a threat actor access my environment? And the answer to that is no. A threat actor will find unique ways to get into the environment. What we're trying to build is a way to reduce their time in the environment, identify that they are in the environment, and help train our users to also identify suspicious, malicious emails and activity that's occurring in the environment. They are finding new ways to get in, whether we hear the new buzz terms of artificial intelligence. Threat actors are still using tried and true methods of getting into environments, such as single factor VPN with basic usernames and passwords. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing substantially different than what they've been doing for the past 10 to 20 years. And it's all about asking questions about the state of IT and cybersecurity infrastructure. Yes, we could have security tools such as endpoint detection and response, the EDR, the new antivirus. But is it on how many endpoints is it on? Would be the next set of questions to ask. Yes, we have it. Do we have it covered across everything, including servers and user endpoints? Do we have any gaps or missing endpoints that would not bubble up on the radar because either they can't have the agent or it was missed during installation? Do we have any resource gaps, people, resources that are maintaining these cybersecurity initiatives? Are we helping government entities and function by making sure we have enough people to be able to uh, work on the IT initiatives along with the cybersecurity initiatives and moving them along instead of staying steady state and getting us to the next day and hoping that an incident doesn't occur, such as business email compromise, a threat actor getting into the email system. Um, we can also build a working group, initiate a working group within county governments to help track and monitor cybersecurity initiatives within the county. Because it could be that we have different varying departments need different varying cybersecurity needs for their department. Um, it might be scalable and work across multiple departments, but at least we have a central way of tracking and understanding how cybersecurity is maturing through an environment and through the government organization. And then from a tracking perspective, it's identify a framework to be able to uh, track measures such as NIST CSF 2.0, which is a cybersecurity framework that identifies and helps track maturing functions, such as do we have assets that are identified within the environment? Are they tracked? Do we have HR policies that deal with onboarding and offboarding employees so we don't have user accounts that are laying around that a threat actor could potentially use if they were to gain access in the environment, especially if onboarding and offboarding is of an employee that has administrative access within the network. Unfortunately, I've worked cases where accounts were used in an environment of an employee that had left, we'll just say, several months prior. But unfortunately, it had services or had items that were attached to it that they just couldn't take the account out because it would have broken services, unfortunately. Um, so, how do we track cybersecurity maturity across a government agency, especially one that is as complex as a county government? Uh, and how do we come together and form somewhat of an alliance to all achieve that one goal of building a nice baseline for the activities to help mature the cybersecurity. Typically, we see sheriffs and police departments and county governments separate but come together for those initiatives of maturing a cybersecurity. We also see the water districts and some of the critical infrastructure uh, areas that are separate from county government also work together to help protect those critical assets, especially from a critical infrastructure perspective, such as water districts. Um, Clean water, we do know threat actors don't necessarily tend to go after critical infrastructure when it deals with ransomware, but we do have nation states, we do have hacktivists that do like to target the critical infrastructure side of a public institution. So these are some of the next steps that can help push along cybersecurity within a government agency is asking those questions, and we'll get to some of those questions that we can ask here in a second. But then it's also tracking the maturity and being true. It's okay to say, "I am not mature in this section. This is what I need to focus on. I need to focus on maturing this area to help with my cybersecurity." But it's also helping prioritize those remediations because we can spend all day maturing a cybersecurity control that actually not might not be active to a threat actor and help prevent threat actor identification or threat actor detection within an environment. And we know resources at government level when it comes to funds are always going to be our huge limiting factor. And how can we do more with less will always be the terminology and the phrase that we all love to hear, I think. How can you do more with less? I don't know how many times I got to hear that working with the state of Florida. It was always quite interesting. Um, so, what is building that groundwork? Like, how do we protect ourselves from a threat actor trying to get in? And the reason why it's good to have communication, not just within your county yourself or your entity or your organization, but also outside. Typically, if threat actors are targeting one county in a state, they are more than likely targeting multiple counties within that state. That activity is going to be observed across multiple areas of the state and even cross state. How do we share that information? So when we're building a mature program, it's going to start with the users. It's going to start with the endpoints. Yeah. So from a leadership perspective, it's asking those questions about how many endpoints do we have in the environment? These are all entryways into the county government. And how that endpoint is used, whether it's a user's laptop or a server, it's how can that endpoint be further protected or is it protected? So we have monitoring for the environment. How have we identified the software in the environment? What software is being used? Uh, so we know if there is an application that's not authorized to be on any of the computers. If it appears, it might be an incident of what we like to call a tripwire of saying, hey, that application is strange. Why did it pop up on that computer? Could cause more work for the team that's helping to protect the environment, but at least it's an indicator or a step in the right direction. Could end up being benign. Maybe it was an application that got approved out of band, but we have seen it help in other entities or other organizations where unknown software was observed on the network, and it was a threat actor that had installed that software on that endpoint. The other portion is also extending that to third party vendors and tools. How many third party tools, how many third party vendors are active in the environment? How many of them have access to the environment through remote management tools? Can they access your environment without permission from government employees? Yeah, can they come in at any time per services? Because if they can come in at any time, very possible if that tool is misused that a threat actor could also use that tool to come in at any time. Or if there's a vulnerability, also use that vulnerability to unfortunately gain access to the network. Um, Have we identified and practiced cybersecurity incident response plans? Tabletop exercises being the top of that list. Have we got the group of key players together to go through a mock incident and to walk through the plan to be able to practice? And unfortunately, yes, it does take time and it's really hard to bring everyone together at one moment to be able to practice this. But being able to practice it is similar to practicing fire drills, practicing um, disaster recovery. It helps understand where those gaps are in an incident to help mature your cybersecurity in your environment. It helps identify policies and procedures that need to be tuned or maybe even created. They go a long way for insurance companies. They go a long way for auditors, but they also go a long way if an incident was to occur, because the term that a lot of legal attorneys like to use that are on the opposite side of an incident happens is they love to use negligence. You know, what does it mean to be negligent when it comes to cybersecurity? What does it mean to be doing the best that we can and a cybersecurity incident still happens, but you're still forced to defend yourself because a cybersecurity incident did happen? And having policies, procedures, and methods and processing away helps build that groundwork, that framework that there is a cybersecurity program that exists, and tools and people are doing the best that they can to protect that network. Um, I like to use the Move It example as somewhat of a, we were doing what we could to transfer applications. Move It is a file sharing application. A lot of on-prem uh, items existed. 2023, a ransomware group was able to find a vulnerability in that application. Move It had best practices. They encrypted every single file that existed on the system. So you couldn't just take a file off of Move It and read it. You had to decrypt it with the keys that were protected by the application. So all organizations that used this application were following best practices to making sure that the data would be removed after X number of days, 14, 24 days or so, making sure that the endpoints or the files on the system were encrypted and had username and authentication. It wasn't just sharing files without authentication. The vulnerability involved the threat actor being able to install a uh, basically a back door that they could log into and then use the Move It applications API to decrypt every single file as they pulled it out. So that way they had every file already decrypted. Even though it was on the system in an encrypted format, it was still unfortunately pulled out, decrypted, and belonged to the ransomware group at that time. And they're they're still up to there's these antics today with other FTP and similar programs. So it's how do you protect yourself against those types of attacks? How do you know a threat actor is taking multiple gigabytes, we'll just say multiple gigs of data from your network? You know, how are we tracking it? How do we know we're tracking it? How do we know if that was to occur in our environment? And that's where identifying these public services, you know, and what happens when they're down, or what happens if they're, let's say, I don't want to say misbehaving, but have unique attributes such as a constant flow of data that's running out of them. How can we track that? How do we know something is going on? And then what are we using to track the cybersecurity maturity in the environment across the board? Also, from a county governance perspective, do you track maturity from an entire county's perspective, or do you break it down to individual departments? And there really is no right answer to this question. It's all about how you want to divide it within your environment. Smaller county governments like to track it across the board. Larger county governments like to break it down into individual departments or functions and then bring them together from a higher level perspective. And how do we interact with counties and government entities around us? How do we bring other entities in? How do we share that information? It does go a long way. Information sharing acts have been or have existed. Unfortunately, we've had one here recently expire on 30th of September, but they do play a vital role in being able to share information within counties, within government entities successfully, without fear of repercussion, right? So the fear of sharing information is that fear that, oh, somebody's going to know that I had an issue. And then that's where legal teams and communication teams and county leaders come together just to find that threshold of what information is comfortable with sharing with other county governments, with other entities. What are we seeing? Bringing everybody together. And then with that, you need a way of logging data. How much data are we logging and how much time to store that data is good enough? We had an organization that was handed their firewall configuration by the FBI that the threat actor took a year prior to them receiving it in their hands. They didn't know that their firewall configuration was taken. They had a year's worth of logs that they could review. They were able to prove that the threat actor could not or did not make it past their initial access and left, but they were able to prove that they did have an issue a year prior. That is, I will say, a very small case. We do not have a lot of organizations that have a year's worth of data, nor were they been able to do it because one, it takes time, it takes money, it takes resources to be able to have that information at hand. And the biggest aspect is a tool does not solve all the problems. It's people and processes and plans that come together to use the tools. It's it's interesting when you walk into an environment and they have every tool that you could possibly imagine. And unfortunately, a threat actor still got in because someone wasn't watching the alerts. Someone wasn't fully looking at the content of the alert. Someone misused what the alert was trying to tell them within the environment. And even though the tools were working, they were trying to protect and detect in the environment. It was the processes that ultimately let them down and unfortunately still resulted in an impact to the environment. And I like to say gorging on tools because there is this mindset out there that you can throw as many tools, you can buy as many tools that you can, and that's going to save you from threat actors. We have, unfortunately, many examples where that's not the case. What saves organizations is reducing that dwell time, the amount of time that a threat actor is in the environment, and then specifically picking the tools that works with your team, that works with the county, that helps build that cybersecurity maturity. So that way you're identifying exactly what needs to go into the environment, exactly what needs to help improve that maturity across the board. And then from this one image I had over here is, what does ad hoc versus define versus manage versus optimized from a maturity level? What does that even mean? Um, yes, it's subjective, but there are milestones or goals you can use to help, such as, does someone in your environment have the sole knowledge of this process in their head? Is it written down? If that one person does have the sole knowledge, then we consider that ad hoc, meaning it's not fully vetted, it's not fully processed, it's not fully repeatable. So how do we take it from an ad hoc to a defined? How do we take it from a defined to a managed? And how do we take it from a managed to an optimized? And it's continuously putting this out into the environment and into all your cybersecurity and IT um, champions that are in the government organization. And how do we make sure that we're maturing along the edge? And how do we trust that that is occurring with the environment? I wish I could say that it never has happened, but we do walk in. We're like, yeah, we thought we had this security agent on every endpoint, but it appears we did not have it on every endpoint. And unfortunately, it came in. The threat actor was able to get on this one endpoint that had no security protection or monitoring, and they were able to unfortunately laterally move without through the environment. and unfortunately does happen. So how do we maintain that maturity? And it's the conversation that keep going. It's the oversight along with everything else that occurs in county government. It's just one of those items that helps build the groundwork, helps maintain the cybersecurity side of the house. And we do see a lot of organizations moving towards it. Um, so I know we've talked a lot of incidents, real world incidents, and I really just wanted to put them all in one spot to talk about them. Um, you know, we know cybersecurity is important. We get it, we understand it, but it's how do we implement it, and how do we monitor it, and how do we know if a threat actor or an unauthorized user is in the environment. And unfortunately, what are the impacts if a threat actor does get in or does have unauthorized access? Um, so just kind of going through some of our real world incidents, we've unfortunately had a county that went down due to ransomware, and I know we've talked about it a couple of times, but just really want to put an emphasis on understanding applications. If we go back to the point of what do your services look like? In this case, it was property title searching. Um, it was not on their top five of their items that if this service was to go down, it would create an issue within the county, but it did. It was the one that was talked about the most. It was the one they were getting the most questions on because real estate couldn't be dealt within the county. Um, and at the same time, 911 was down. So we had 911 down, dispatch couldn't occur. Um, but property title searching was the one that was getting the most impact. So what does that mean for other applications within the environment? Can court still operate if services were to go down hard in a county government? Um, could police still do their job? Could arrests still occur? Could bookings still occur? Does the jail still work? These are some of the questions when we're trying to identify the services and applications that exist within the environment. Uh, County documents from a county clerk's office was accessed through remote management software from a third party vendor. Do we have identification of all the third parties that have access to critical items within the environment? Do we know when they come in? Do we get alerts when they access the county's government out of band? Um, because even though the third parties still need to do their job, it's still the county's data, the data custodians. The third party is not going to get the call saying, hey, the data has been unauthorized access. It's going to be the county. The county government is going to be the one that is going to be in the news or is going to be getting the calls. So, how do we protect that information? If we use third party services, there is a recent one out there where an entire county's court documents, including sealed documents, were available publicly. No authentication, no access tracked to get into the environment. The documents were existing, could be, I will say, easily found, hanging out on the web. And it includes all court documents with sealed implications, including juvenile records. And what does that mean to a county's perspective, to a notification, legal ramifications of this type of incident? Did that involve a threat actor? It did not, but it's still a security incident involving a third party with county data that was not properly protected. And how do we also, on the flip side of that, prevent a threat actor such as a ransomware group from taking sensitive legal documents? Do we know where those legal documents exist? Sensitive victim information that, if it was to be posted by a ransomware group, would unfortunately cause re-victimization of the people that would be identified in those court case documents, and depending on the severity of the case information. And then 911 going down. Unfortunately, we do deal with this a lot with the counties because of how interconnected some of the systems are. Also, a lot of it has to do with the state just cutting off access to central CGIS information, and until there's an attestation that, hey, the network is safe to be reconnected. And every state, unfortunately, handles CGIS information slightly different. And even though we do have the FBI's uh, MOUs coming down, but I will say every state that we've worked with handles it slightly different, and how much work they go into of comparing whether uh, they're meeting the requirements is also different. But unfortunately, it also impacts not just users and data, but we have threat actors that are redirecting invoices, meaning the payment goes to the threat actor and not the third party that the payment is supposed to be going to. This could be somewhere from small invoices to large contracts within a county government, and unfortunately, has happened way more often than most people realize, because these are the types of incidents that don't hit the news unless it's a large public contract. And unfortunately, it also does impact employees, because we do have paycheck redirection for direct deposits that do occur across the board, not just in public, but also in private organizations. And unfortunately, they're also really good at redirecting those notifications that, hey, your direct deposit has been changed, because they're normally in the email that is supposed to receive the notification that the direct deposit has been modified. So it's always beneficial to have those two emails if possible. And unfortunately, it has a direct impact on the employees. Sometimes they don't know this has occurred until paycheck time, and the direct deposit doesn't go in. And unfortunately, we've had this happen with uh, groups of people because of what the threat actor has been able to get in and uh, change. So from that perspective, what can we do as leaders to help push cybersecurity? I mean, it's not always easy, and it doesn't always provide the best results. Threat actors are active. I can tell you, just today we've probably had 3 new cases, um, ranging from business email compromise to ransomware to accidental posting of data. And the difference between reactive and proactive is, if an incident were to occur, we're not trying to figure out where to go. We know where we're going if an incident occurs. That's what takes the table from reactive to proactive. It's not saying that an incident is never going to occur, but it's now we have a process in place. We have the tools to be able to tell us exactly what happened within the environment, with log data being the most beneficial. With log data, I can tell where a threat actor had been. We can track their movements, potentially what files they were trying to access, potentially how much data they did take, if any. And it helps paint a better story about the threat actor's motives. For example, business email compromise. We look at search terms. Search terms are important, because if the threat actor is searching for wire, invoice, and fraud, we know that they're not necessarily going after protected health information, that they are really going after finance and invoice fraud. And it helps say, hey, we have low probability that they were trying to access PHI in this mailbox. Could they have inadvertently got it? Unfortunately, yes, but this was the goal of the threat actor. So it's all about, how do we paint that picture? How do we keep pushing as much as we can in a real world environment to help prevent these real world incidents, or shrink their impact, is the ultimate goal of cybersecurity, and keeping asking those questions of how we maintain cybersecurity. I know we talked about it the last time, the updated checklist. Just wanted to add it here again. Um, what does it mean to improve cybersecurity, and what are those steps? And we know, we hear it, multi-factor authentication. We know threat actors are good at bypassing it, but having it and not having it are still two different aspects of the coin. Having it and a threat actor bypassing it is not as severe as not having, and a threat actor walking in with usernames and passwords. Insurance companies know it, auditors know it, We all know threat actors unfortunately have plenty of frameworks to get around it. Is there new technology that can help prevent it? Sure. But it's about that critical initial baseline. And it's understanding the tools in your environment. I know we pick on EDR, but I'm a big fan of firewall logs because that can help us identify the amount of data that's coming in and out of an environment and potentially where a threat actor laterally moved to within the environment. And all about hardening and supply chain and how how do we just keep our foot on the pedal of cybersecurity by also making sure our employees are able to function and the county constituents are able to access public services. And there's a lot floating around. And sometimes people don't realize just how much energy goes into maintaining the technology side of a county government until it goes down. And that was obvious yesterday when AWS went down. That many people, yeah, realized just how much one one entity has running very important services. Um, so, would like to leave this time for questions. I do appreciate the opportunity to do these three webinars. They've been fun to make and get to talk about cybersecurity and just from a government's perspective because it's a challenge. We get the least funds, we get the least resources, but still get to make magic happen and protect as much as we can. And yeah, we know it's a battle. We see it every day. So do appreciate the time and didn't know if there's any questions we want to open up to the floor.
Thank you again, Joshua. I really appreciate it. And I did want to mention that if you haven't been able to watch the first and second webinars as well, they are up on the website. So if you want to go back and dive into any of those topics, if you missed either of those, um, we'll absolutely be happy to share the links to those too. Are there any questions for Joshua? I know it's a lot of information, but definitely recommend following up and asking any questions. And like I said, there will be folks from his team at the conference as well. But truly, just invaluable to hear the real world examples, Joshua, of what other counties have faced, and really puts it into perspective. As county leaders, what we need to be thinking about. So. Really appreciate you sharing your experience.
No problem. No, we definitely don't mind sharing it, and it's also good to reach across those county aisles. You never know what another county might be going through, um, and we do find it uh, extremely beneficial on that information sharing side because sometimes uh, maybe they have a plan that they can share, or even talking through it. Uh, Other issues like, yeah, we saw that activity. That's interesting. Um, we've seen it where they've shared information and they saw the same, we'll say, MO happening at two different counties, that they were able to track it down and extinguish it before it became a bigger problem.